Hey everyone, long time no see, but it is finally time for episode 5 of Alan Drinks Whiskey and Talks About Gin. Though, as you can tell by the big board behind me and the clear liquid that I have in my hand, I am not drinking whiskey today. I am drinking gin. And I must say, this is the first time I've had gin straight, and it is not great. It is not my thing. But much as Winston Smith perseveres through the life of the party in Oceania in 1984 and life on Airstrip 1, I will persevere through these 2 ounces of gin that I poured myself for the sake of literature. But let's talk a little bit about 1984. 1984 is a really, really interesting book. It's one of my favorite books. And actually, this is kind of a requested episode. I have some students who have found my channel. Hello to you. And they said, hey, you should do an episode of 1984, and you should drink gin. So here we are. Victory gin for everyone, except for the proles. The proles like beer. So in case it's been a while since you were in high school or whatever, whenever you would have read 1984, here's a brief synopsis. Our protagonist is Winston Smith, and he's pretty dissatisfied with life in Oceania, which I don't blame him because life sucks. Even though they drink Victory gin and live in Victory mansions and smoke Victory cigarettes, everything just kind of sucks. The Victory gin is oily and greasy. The Victory mansions are clearly falling apart, and the tobacco falls out of the Victory cigarettes. And I'm not a smoker, but I would have to imagine that that is not a plus. Winston also knows that the party lies about everything. There's not any truth to be found. That's partly because of his job. His job is to literally rewrite records so that the party is always in the right. Because he is fed up with the world, he falls in love with Julia, another member of the party, as part of a mini rebellion. They have an affair. I'm not quite sure what to think of Julia. I don't think Winston knows what to think of Julia. Winston is all about overthrowing the party, but Julia's like, just try to outlive. Like, live as long as you can and be happy. That's rebellion enough for me. Winston makes friends with O'Brien and he joins the Brotherhood, and things are going really, really well. But then, in a twist, which maybe we should have seen coming, O'Brien is a member of the inner party, and Winston is caught, and then he's tortured until he betrays Julia, everything that he ever cared about, and eventually he loves Big Brother, and then he dies? We don't really know what happens to Winston at the end of the book. We just know that he loves Big Brother, but my personal theory is that he dies. You have O'Brien saying that sooner or later we will shoot you, and then when they talk about the 3 inner party members that Winston saw a photograph of, which makes him know that everything is a lie that the party says, O'Brien says that in the end they begged to be shot quickly so they could die with their minds clean. I have to think that that's what happens to Winston at the end, but I don't know. So I want to talk a little bit about dystopian literature because dystopian literature is a big thing in young adult literature, and I talked about a young adult novel or 2 novels in this show, the series that starts with Children of Blood and Bone, and even though that's fantasy, high fantasy at that, it's still a pretty dystopian society. But if you think of like the Hunger Games or Divergent, things like that, dystopia is a really big deal in young adult literature. And usually in young adult literature, the protagonist can win the day and reform society. That's what happens in Hunger Games. But in adult dystopias, usually our protagonist dies, as I believe happens to Winston, for sure happens to John the Savage in Brave New World, or he submits, which best case scenario is what happens to Winston. As they say in 1984, if you want an image of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Here's to that. So literature usually is a mirror to society. So where are we in terms of 1984, Brave New World, a dystopian future? Do we have boots stamping on human faces as we speak? quite possibly, you can make a pretty strong case that elements of dystopia are creeping into our society. Just as an example, look at how the United States government failed to respond to COVID-19. And yes, you could make a serious argument that no matter what the government did, the death toll would have been high and unacceptable. But the United States far outstrips other developed nations with how the virus has affected us. But even getting away from that, our inability to recognize healthcare as a human right, literally placing the profits of insurance companies and medical providers over people, is pretty dystopian. And what's more, this is normalized. People run against expanding healthcare coverage. People run against giving people more control over their healthcare. Now, they don't say it in those words, but that's really what's happening. People defend this, and people vote for those people. And so, to that regard, I think that the machine has been weaponized against us, and more often than not, we pull the trigger. And even right now, even though there's one party in Washington that controls Congress and the White House, there's still a big argument about whether or not you should expand to Medicaid for all or Medicare for all. And there's not even everyone in that party, the Democratic Party, that believes that we should. Which begs the question, what's the purpose? What's the point? I know one thing that I have been thinking ever since January 20th, when Biden was inaugurated, and we've had democratically controlled Congress, is that there's been all this talk about passing COVID relief, but here we are a month into the presidency, and it still hasn't happened yet. Am I just being impatient, or am I thinking that maybe our government should be a little bit more quick on the uptake to respond to a national crisis, one that many of the people that are newly elected ran on solving? If you're going to have government, do something with it. If not, are you just having power for power's sake? Now, there's other dystopian elements within our society. There's the lack of online privacy, which we invite into our own homes. When you ask Alexa or Siri for anything, that's what you're doing. There's the soaring cost of education, which will eventually ensure that college education either will put you deeply into debt or is something for only the wealthy, maybe who are already there. So there's the militarization of the police, which kind of always just gave me kind of a dystopian vibe. There's the rollback of environmental regulations that we've seen. There's voter suppression that goes along. And then you also have various media branches not even attempting to report objective reality. If you look at, I believe it's OAN, for instance, they just broadcast conspiracy theories. Tucker Carlson is given a prime time slot on Fox News to say whatever he wants. And this isn't just a right side of the thing. There's plenty of left-wing outlets that are kind of divorced from reality as well. And you don't really get much more 1984 than that if your media doesn't respect facts and information, and they don't trust viewers to take in facts and information and make their own decisions, and you're getting pretty dystopian. But, can we really complain about whether or not the news media is reporting on reality? Because what is reality? I wish in reality gin tasted better than it does. But if Winston can imagine O'Brien floating out of a room and believing it, which he doesn't, but this is how he figures that O'Brien could float out of a room and it be factual. And if Winston can make himself believe that 2 and 2 make 5, then who's to say what we can't do? Maybe we can believe our greatness. I was actually just talking to some friends about this today, that there's kind of a mythos in the United States. We are the greatest country in the world. But then if you look at metrics in terms of, like, say, happiness and citizen wealth and healthcare coverage and things like that, the United States lags behind. Now, this isn't to say that the United States is this awful place, but it could be better. It could be improved. The American experiment continues. But if we think that the American experiment, 1, is completed, and B, was a rousing success, then, well, 2 + 2 = 5. And if we're confronted with evidence to the contrary, dismiss it, call it fake news. We literally did that 4 years ago when Trump was inaugurated, and we were informed with the, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that it was the greatest well-attended inauguration ever. Those photographs be damned. If you want to think about it, this is doublethink. In case it's been a while since you remember what doublethink is, doublethink, it means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. For instance, believing that the election was rigged while still waiting and waiting and waiting for the evidence to come and show it. To say that, yes, this election was rigged, I feel it in my bones. And the people who believe that, they believe that. I think for some of them, it's not just, oh, I hope it was, or I have this feeling. I think they believe it deep down in their bones that it was. But is there evidence? No, there was no evidence to support this claim. But it's going to come, right? But if that evidence never comes, was the election not rigged? You'd have to ask someone who believes if the election was rigged or not, what that means. But I think this is a pretty good example of doublethink. I don't think the concepts that Orwell is bandying about in his book, like doublethink and Crime Stop, are all that far-fetched. I think they're things that we deal with in our society today. And at the end of the day, it comes down to rejecting our own reality. I'm just going to pretend that this is whiskey. So good. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. I think one of the most chilling parts of the book, really, is when they're in Hate Week and they decide to switch who they're fighting from East Asia to Eurasia. And if I got that wrong, I apologize. But really, even the book says there's not really an objective difference between East Asia and Eurasia, or even Oceania. They're all kind of the same thing. They're just fighting proxy wars against one another. But there's a guy that's making a speech denouncing the country they're at war with, but then they switch it. And he doesn't even break syntax. He doesn't ever think about, like, wait a minute, I was denouncing one country, now I have to denounce the other. There's not even a pause to reflect that. He just goes with the change. What's more, everybody else goes along with the change. The banners are wrong. They have to tear them down. They blame Goldstein. It's a whole thing. And everyone goes along with it because you have to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. And in this age of conspiracy theories, you can find evidence for whatever you want. If you want to believe that the world is flat, there's plenty of YouTube videos out there that will tell you that the world is flat. It doesn't matter that we've known that it's not for thousands of years. You can find evidence that it's flat. You want evidence that we never landed on the moon? It's out there. You want evidence of QAnon? It's out there. You might have to do a little bit of doublethink to accept it, but there you go. As a teacher, sometimes I talk about trustworthy information. But what is that? Why accept that the world is round when you can reject the evidence and submit your own? Why accept that the world is anything if it doesn't make you feel good? And that's kind of what this gets at. That's why I tend to think that we're more of a Brave New World dystopia than a 1984 one, because in 1984, there is no attempt to make people feel good. Brave New World, on the other hand, they do. And I think in this case, we do, because we can buy into our conspiracy theories. Why does your life suck? Because everyone's out to get you. You can find evidence for that on the internet. You just submit your own evidence. You submit your own claims. Who cares if it was peer-reviewed? Your reality is your own reality. And as they say in the book, as they say in 1984, reality is just what you believe it to be. If Winston believes that O'Brien floats out of the room, and O'Brien simultaneously believes that he floated out of the room, then for all intents and purposes, O'Brien floated out of the room. It doesn't matter that it's physically impossible. They believed it to happen, so it did. Conspiracy theories might help people make sense of the world, but they do so in harmful ways that force them to reject evidence and reason, or science. These things that should be bedrock foundational things of a society. But the whiskey came up a little bit there. Why go along with what other people say if it doesn't make you feel good? This is one thing that I've talked about with students, actually. That when we research controversial issues, and I never say, if you want to get an A on this paper, this has to be the way that you think or write about it. That would be bad on my part. I've graded lots of papers that I disagreed with that have gotten high marks. And I've even read papers that I agreed with, but they didn't get good marks because they didn't find good information. They didn't cite sources correctly. They didn't argue well enough for their points, or vice versa, they did. But you can't just research what makes you feel good or what makes you right, because if you do, then you're just in an echo chamber. Then you might as well just love Big Brother. You might as well roll with the punches. There's no sense in doing anything substantial because you can just find the evidence that says that you are right and the people that disagree with you are wrong. And more than that, the people that agree with you are on the side of good, and the people that disagree with you are on the side of evil. So, is there any hope in all of this? It lies in the proles. That's what Winston comes to the conclusion of. And I think that's a conclusion that Orwell comes to as well, is that hope lies in the proles, just the general population of people. But O'Brien says the proles can't rebel. They'll never rebel, not in a million years. They'll have no interest to rebel. They won't get organized enough to do it. They don't even know what's going on. They don't even know what's good for them. And I think in some instances we have that. When you elect people who will work against your interests, like people that will vote to not expand health insurance or health coverage, then you're kind of sacrificing your own freedom and your own happiness. You're giving them to boot to stamp on your face. If you keep electing people that run on platforms of continuing to militarize the police, that's what you're going to get. If you keep electing people that are going to put the profits of corporations over the health and safety of people, well, then you love Big Brother. And more to the point, if you keep electing people who have a disregard for democracy, and as we found out, there are clearly legislators and congresspeople who don't value the democratic process, then we're stabbing our own face with our own boot. And it's up to us, the proles, while we still have those rights, to rise up and make sure that those rights continue. But again, in the face of the election, there's like over 160 voter repression bills that have popped up around the country. It's something that's not going away. And there's bills to decriminalize running over protesters. Those bills popped up after the Standing Rock protests in the Dakotas. There are laws to limit and restrict voting. And Arizona even proposed a law that would allow the state legislature to overturn the election results if it didn't like them. And the Secretary of State in Arizona called it some of the worst legislation she's ever seen. So Orwell's alarm from 1949 is still going strong all these years later. Yeah, the hope still lies in the proles because it lies in our ability to organize, to march, and petition, but we only have that right if we use it. We only have the right to organize if we organize. We can't just organize when it's too late. You can't use, if they take away your right to march, you can't use it. So you have to march now. You have to petition now while you still have those rights. While you still have your voice to be heard, you have to use it. If you don't, well, then you don't. If the polls don't catch on to this soon, well, then we might as well just admit that we love Big Brother and we live in 1984. So yeah, the hope lies in the proles, but I hope it is. Anyway, I hope this discussion is more optimistic than you might otherwise think. I do think there's a bit of optimism in 1984 and Brave New World, even though for our protagonists, it doesn't end well in those books. But I think the hope lies outside of them. We have to remember that 1984 and Brave New World and books like that are fiction, and they tell us a story ultimately about ourselves. And that story is that we have power. 1984 and Brave New World and other dystopian works are warnings. They're warnings against systems that overreach and overpower themselves. They are stories that say, this is what could happen, and it's up to you, dear reader, to make sure that it doesn't. So, here's to the proles. Here's to them finding their voice. And here's to us taking the boot off of our face. Thanks for watching episode 5 of Alan Drinks Whiskey and Talks About Books. I always have a lot of fun doing these. I have a lot of fun just talking about books. I've got another one in the works coming soon about the 3-body problem that I am excited to do. I read that book at the beginning of this year, and it blew my mind. So I'm looking forward to talking about that one with you. So until episode 6, cheers and keep reading.